Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. In the last part we went through all of Aquastar and now we've entered World 4 Neo Star. We're going to be seeing a lot of jungle-themed levels here, which makes the fact I'm immediately wielding a fire weapon a little bit haphazard, but thankfully Kirby can only selectively light things on fire that are vulnerable to it or that he wants to, and he doesn't want to start a forest fire. I mean, he's Kirby! This level off the top of my head, I don't think you need a specific power combo to get all the crystal shards, but something you should watch out for in this long first section here is pitfall traps like the one just below that star. That first one's there to teach you that they're there at all. There's nothing that can actively harm you in it. But most future ones, which are going to be largely located between logs you can jump on as platforms like this one here, are going to have spikes in it, so you might want to stay relatively airborne or towards the middle of the screen, so to speak, verticality-wise. Because otherwise, you might be taking some pretty silly hits. Also, fun little detail there, that's kind of consistent in the series as well. Any enemy that kind of hangs down off of a web, you can destroy the web and just have them fall to the ground. Sometimes they'll kill them outright, sometimes they'll fall into hazards, which will kill them outright. Largely, if you're good about placing things, you don't need to worry too much about stuff. For right now, let's actually get back to talking about the game's design team. We got through a good couple of the members last time. Next up is Tetsuya Mochizuki, who actively started on Kirby's Pinball Land as a staff member there. Then they were in the special thanks for Alcahest. They then worked on Kirby Superstar and this as a designer, as well as Melee, with Kirby, as usual, being a mainstay through most of their career to modern day, with their most recent credits being in Kirby in the Forgotten Land and Return to Dreamland Deluxe as a project manager. With that said, one little fun out-of-nowhere entry there is that they were actually a coder with Zennerworks for Okage Shadow King on PS2, right after Melee, which is just kind of out of nowhere compared to everything else, but really fun to see. Next up is Tomomi Minami, who seemingly is largely a level designer or field artist in some regard across their career. They started on Kirby Superstar as a mapper, same with Kirby's Dream Land 3. They were then on this, Melee, Nightmare in Dreamland, and then basically every product of Kirby moving forward, all the way up until the most recent release, being a field artist for Kirby's Dream Buffet, as well as the new little expansion campaign they added in the Switch 2 version of Forgotten Land, which I'll play at some point. My goal is to kind of find a cheap copy of Forgotten Land for like 20, 30 bucks and then pay the rest for the upgrade because I'm not paying 70 for a Kirby game. Next up is Sanai Kubota. They actively started as an animator on Kirby's Block Ball, then they were a designer on Dreamland 3, and then this. Melee, they were a designer, and then they were a level designer in some form for things like Kirby's Air Ride, Nightmare in Dreamland, and their most recent credit was actually in Superstar Ultra as a motif designer. After them is Yoichi Tsukino. This is only one of the two games they've worked on. They worked on this and Smash 64 as a designer. Tatsuhiro Tanoue, on the other hand, started on Kirby Superstar as a CG designer, then they were on this. They largely worked on a lot of Kirby games as well moving forward, after that being a designer, technical support member for things like Canvas Curse, Return to Dreamland, Robobot, and all that, with the most recent credit being the same thing for Forgotten Land and its Switch 2 version. But notably, they were also in the special thanks for P-Cross 3D. They were a development environment team for Wii Sports and Wii Play. But also, notably, they're credited as working on Sis Dolphin for Smash Melee. Sis Dolphin, I actively had to look up what that was because that really struck me as odd. That's actually a middleware tool that HAL Labs made that was used for game engine side stuff, sound tools, but also outright just making 3D animatics and animations for the games in question. I wouldn't be surprised if Sis Dolphin's the middleware they used to make the Smash Melee intro, for instance. But that's a little bit of game history I didn't even know about because I had never heard that term before. I actually saw Sis Dolphin and first thought, like, wait, did this person work on, like, the OS for the GameCube in some way? What's going on there? Next up is Tadashi Hashikura, who started as an assistant graphic designer on Metal Slayer Glory with HAL. And then they were a character designer for Kirby's Adventure, CG designer for Dream Course, as well as Superstar. Star Stacker designer, just generally a designer for most of the series, moving forward into modern day where they're still a field artist with the most recent releases. The only real sidetracks along that career are being a designer for P-Cross 3D, as well as a designer for Smash Melee. Time for something I mentioned earlier in the LP. That means that card is a dupe. You have no way of knowing you're going to get a dupe until you actually grab it, which is why I'm not going for all the cards, because the odds get so ridiculously small by the end. It's not worth the time. Now, worth noting, I've talked about this game's soundtrack being generally really relaxing, and it is, with some minor exceptions. But I think my biggest disappointment with the soundtrack is actually the Invincibility theme. I mean, it's a good song, but it's hard to match the main Invincibility theme from basically every other Kirby game. If only because it's both, a really good song as it is, but also one of the most hyper-energetic, oh my god, I need to dash forward as fast as I can and not let anything stop me songs I think a video game has ever created. And the fact that's really only not in this game off the top of my head compared to other Kirby soundtracks has always just felt a little weird. So this stage starts off with another Waddle Dee minecart sequence, quite literally a minecart in this case compared to the last time, which we were on like a river flow. This one's definitely more dangerous than the last one, if only because I think there's chances where you can die instantly if you don't do a jump ahead of time and they don't warn you about those. But I do think the exclamation marks to tell you when to jump are a little more useful here when they actually use them, only because the rocks you need to jump over blend in quite a bit more than the rocks in the water. And there's one thing about this game's hitboxes in a way that always kind of bothers me, and this stage is a good example of it. Specifically, we're going to come up on these guys here, these little block guys that probably have a name I just don't know off the top of my head. Most hazards like that in a video game, they would only actively damage you if you touch them from below or when they crush you. These guys are outwardly enemies in such a way in that if you just touch them even from the sides or brush up against them, you're going to take a hit. And I won't lie, it's always felt a little bit awkward due to that. I feel like they should have been treated more as hazards than enemies, if that makes sense to make that a little easier to get around. But at the same time, it's not that big a deal again, because they're only in maybe like 4 stages in the game off the top of my head, maybe 5. And even then, I'm going entirely based off memory, which is probably completely wrong at the same time. So one of the crystal shards in this level actually does require a copy ability combo. And it's a combo that's very powerful, but also, if you're not careful, very dangerous. And whenever I use it, I am not very careful because I always forget how to protect myself from it. Specifically, we're going to need Stone and Bomb, but I believe I do need to backtrack to get Bomb at some point here, so I'm not going to talk about what the ability does until we actually see it. Just worth noting before you get too much further, I suppose. Going back to the game staff for now, I suppose, though. Next up in the design team is Masanobu Yamamoto. They actively have several projects before Kirby even shows up, specifically Starblade on the PlayStation and 3DO, Pyramid Patrol on the 3DO, Zeitgeist on PlayStation, and Galaxian Cubed on PlayStation, which largely means they worked with Namco or Taito prior to their time with Nintendo in any regard. Specifically, they are a CG designer, so they're usually involved in the 3D asset creation and all that. Before Kirby shows up, though, they actually worked on another game for Nintendo. Specifically, they worked on Pokemon Snap and the semi-arcade release that was actually more the version that could actually print your stuff as a designer. But then they joined HAL properly, and they've been on Kirby ever since as a designer. Creative support on Squeak Squad, character supervisor for Epic Yarn, producer on Mass Attack. They're largely in a supervisor role now for the series, with their most recent credit being in Star Allies and Special Thanks or in Smash Ultimate as a supervisor. Very regularly credited, but mostly in Special Thanks roles nowadays. Next up is Tsuyoshi Wakayama. Their first credit is in Uchuke Bitai's SDF on NES, which I believe was a HAL Laboratories-made shooter game that just never released here in the West. They were then a designer for Ghostbusters 2, part of the Hyperzone team for Hyperzone. They were in the Special Thanks section for Mega Man 5 of all things. But then the usual HAL stuff starts showing up. We're going to see Kirby's Adventures. They were a level designer for Alcahest, chief designer of Superstar, lead artist for Smash 64, and then just design chief moving forward for Kirby as a series, with their most recent role being Return to Dreamland Deluxe as a character animator specifically, which means they're largely involved in the animation scene, probably if they're not doing level design or character design. Which, if you're used to other credit sequences, that is a bit of an awkward thing about this game's credits specifically. Whereas other games will credit the more individual roles more specifically, anyone who worked on this game that wasn't a director or a composer or a manager is largely discredited as a designer. So they might be a character artist, they might be another soundtrack composition, they might be a modeler. They're all just credited as design team, which is technically accurate, but a little bit misleading, I find. Also, I think that was the first death we've seen on screen. Yeah, death can take you pretty quickly in this game if you're not careful. So I need to go grab myself a bomb power-up in order to have the power combo for the third crystal shard in that stage, but thankfully there's one pretty early on in Aqua Star's second stage. Stone Bomb, you throw dynamite. It explodes with a very large explosion that can also damage you. You can actively defend against that, though, by crouching, but I always forget to do that, if only because I don't really find myself just crouching at a moment's notice too often in Kirby. Most of the time, if I'm doing that, I'm either doing it as part of an attack, like with Sword Kirby in certain games, dancing to the music here and again with specific songs, or just having busy hands, which even then, with how Kirby's movement pace tends to work in a lot of the other games, I'm not really dancing too much because I can just keep moving through the level design. So we're actively going to need a specific power-up pretty quickly in this stage. I think you just need some variant of Spike, though, to get the first Crystal Shard here. I prefer to use Stone Spike here, only because I can aim that directly downwards. But you can do pretty fine. Stone Spike, you generate a Gurren Logon drill and go forward for a few seconds before firing it off in a direction, and it can kill enemies that way. You can use it in pretty much any of the main directions, and it's pretty nice as a nice little secondary movement utility, because it's one of the few attacks that's just a constant hitbox, but it's slow enough where it's not my main thing I'd like to use like that. I tend to use burn or, well, double burn, technically, a lot more than that. So, going back to the game's dev staff, we're almost done with the design team members. There's Hitoshi Kikawa next up. They started as a debugger on Shanghai for the Game Boy. They were in the special thanks section of New Ghostbusters 2 and NES. Character designer for Arcana on the Super Nintendo, as well as a graphic designer for Alcahest. And then they were a CG designer or just a designer in some visual motif moving forward. Superstar, Smash 64, this, Melee, Nightmare on Dreamland, Air Ride. Design director for Superstar Ultra. Background designer for Kirby's Dream Direction. Level design for Box Boy. And as of recently, they are a character artist for both Kirby and the Forgotten Land and Return to Dreamland Deluxe. Next up is Satoko Nakamura, who started as a designer on Dreamland 3, then they were on Smash 64 and this. But then quickly, their resume becomes the most varied out of anyone we've talked about thus far in this LP, outside of maybe Sakurai himself. They worked as an illustrator for the two favorite Deer games on the PlayStation in Japan, which I believe are turn-based RPG simulation combo games. They were an illustrator for a Prince of Tennis game on the PlayStation. They did additional arts for both Shaman King Master of Spirits games on Game Boy Advance, as well as Yu-Gi-Oh! Nightmare Troubadour on DS. They were a package manual designer. Pokemon Ranger, they were a graphic designer for. They were a photography cooperator on Danganronpa Ultra Despair Girls, which I've heard horrific things about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush Duel, they were a card production team member, and they were most recently credited as a background artist for Emio the Smiling Man, the newest Famicom Detective Club game, which... that game goes places. That game goes places. Good game. Goes places. Speaking of going places, time for one of the other worst crystal shards in the game. Adeleine will paint a painting right there that's completely random depending on your save file. You then need to come to this screen and slowly carve that shape into these star blocks. The umbrella is probably actively the hardest one to make. You can also have to make a top hat, which I believe is a pretty straightforward shape, and a piece of pizza, which is just you making effectively a triangle. The umbrella is the worst one to get, so of course that's what I got. The thing I can't remember off the top of my head, though, and future me, go and test this just to see which way it leans. I can't remember if failing that means you have to start the stage over again to try again, or if you could just re-enter the room and try again. Generally, I think star blocks in this game will stay destroyed if you re-enter a room, so that might be a restart in general, but I cannot quite recall because I get so paranoid about that crystal shard whenever I revisit the game now, that I don't think I've genuinely messed that up in probably over 15 years. Rounding out the main game design team, though, is Kunio Watanabe, who started on Smash 64 as a designer before working on this, Melee, Air Ride, Superstar Ultra, Return to Dreamland, Dream Collection, Triple Deluxe, DDD's Drum Dash Deluxe, Robobop, and Star Allies. They're credited as a designer in the first 4 roles, they're technical support in Star Allies, but they're notably credited for working on movies, so cutscenes, for Superstar Ultra, Return to Dreamland, and Triple Deluxe. I'm assuming they're usually involved in the cutscene cinematography angle or things like that. Also a cute little thing at the end of the level. The last few platforms all spell out Kirby's name. Really, honestly, easy to miss, because I don't think I noticed that for years because I was too focused on trying to avoid the enemies near me. So, this next stage has one of the other more god-dang-it crystal shards in the game. But mostly because the signposting for it is comparatively minor compared to other ones that need power combos. Specifically, before you even enter this stage, I would recommend going out of your way to go grab Double Ice. Most annoying thing is you're not going to need it until the end of the stage, so if you're running low on health, a death can be rather punishing in that case. With that said, this level definitely is a little more dangerous than most of them because the lava here, while it still only does the same amount of damage as everything else, it's really easy to fall into it if you're just trying to rush through things, and between the general level design and platforms moving like this in the early sections, it's pretty easy to take a lot of dumb hits very early on here. So going back to the game's credits, the next roles listed are the assistant directors, and there's 2 listed, Ryuichi Noguchi and Kazuya Konichi. Ryuichi Noguchi technically only has 3 notable projects under their name. They were in the Special Thanks for Melee, they were an assistant director here, and then they worked on character graphics for the company Scarab for the Dreamcast The Ring game from 2000. But I'm also finding, specifically on IMDb, another Ryuichi Noguchi that worked on Resident Evil The Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles as a graphics team member before becoming an art designer for Daemon X Machina. And the roles listed between those two lists are similar enough where I believe it to be the same person, but honestly, it very well could just be a second Ryuichi Noguchi for all I know. Especially considering Moby Games, generally pretty good for figuring out what games people worked on. But as we talked about with them not actively updating Michiko Sakurai's profile in such a way that it actively links her pre-marriage and post-marriage projects correctly, it's possible there's just some weirdness with how Moby Games does things. The other assistant director, though, started on this game, Kazuya Konishi. They then were a package and manual artist for Smash Melee. Then they were a chief artwork person for Nightmare in Dreamland, Air Ride, Amazing Mirror, designer for Canvas Curse, and then they're in the special thanks for technical support sections moving forward, specifically from Rainbow Curse all the way up to Kirby and the Forgotten Land Switch 2 release through the technical support credits largely. Still largely a very Kirby-based resume. Next up is the assistant manager, specifically Ryuki Kuraoka, Yoshiki Suzuki, and Kensuke Tanabe. Ryuki Kuraoka seemingly started with HAL actively with one of the pre-Lolo games for that series with Eggerland Meikyu no Fukatsu in the NES. They then worked on a lot of HAL's projects moving forward, specifically Rollerball on NES. They were a debugger, Hyperzone just on the main staff, main programmer for Arcana, programmer for Alcahest, and then they're a project manager for Superstar, Dreamland 3, Star Stacker, and Smash 64. After Crystal Shards, they were a project manager for Melee, management on Air Ride, then they were a debugger for Amazing Mirror, tester for Canvas Curse, debugger again for Squeak Squad, but then their last credits are, weirdly of all things, Clash of the Titans the video game, and Majin in the Forsaken Kingdom for the PS3 as a project manager for Engines Incorporated, so they're technically through a secondary company that worked with HALP on this game. Next up, Yoshiki Suzuki started on Kirby's Pinball Land as a staff member, then they're a programmer on Adventure, on Earthbound, on Kirby's Dream Land 2, lead programmer on Smash 64, programming director on Melee, technical support on Air Ride, and then moving forward, they were either director on things like P-Cross 3D, assistant director on Round 2 for that. This right here is where you need double ice. We're going to need to come back for that, so I'll talk more about that in a few moments. So largely, Yoshiki Suzuki's last Kirby credit was in Return to Dreamland Deluxe as a project manager, but their most recent credit at large was actually being one of the people who helped animate the Sacred in Monster Hunter World, the weird little chocobo guy that's your main mount throughout that game. I'm not touched Wilds, mostly because I got my Monster Hunter fix with Rise, played a good amount of that, and I'm good for probably a good 10 or 15 years. I like Monster Hunter enough, but it's never a series I outwardly seek out too often, as opposed to some people I know who just eat that series alive anytime there's a new thing and don't touch another game for another, 3 months. Which, hey, if that's how you like to play, good on you. I respect any type of play as long as you're not actively harming other people. Or otherwise just being a complete dick about things, which God knows there's a lot of those on the internet. The final assistant manager is Kensuke Tanabe, who we've actively talked about a couple of other times in other LPs, specifically Kirby ones, I think. Short version started as a level designer on Doki Doki Panic, was then a director for Mario 2 NES in the West, script writer for A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, map designer for Dreamland 2, screenplay advisor for Mario RPG, battle director for Pokemon Stadium, supervisor in general for a lot of the early N64 Pokemon titles, but circa, Canvas Curse on, project-wise, they're one of Nintendo's most prominent producers, producing things like Prime 3, Superstar Ultra, Punch-Out on Wii, Donkey Kong Country Returns, Kirby Mass Attack. Actively, their most recent credit that's not just as a producer on one of Nintendo's other titles is actively for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, where they were a producer and they wrote some of the scan log texts, which that's kind of fun. I haven't finished that game yet. I'm nearing the end of it. That's a pretty cool Metroid Prime. I definitely think people are a little harsh on it in some ways, but at the same time, I feel like that's also because it's like the game was announced 7 years ago and it's been 17 since the last one before that. That's a long time, and expectations I think were just way too high. But there's definitely some notes where I'm like, okay, I want to know the story behind this choice because conflicting. So this is double ice, which I talked about earlier in the LP. Become a giant snowball and roll forward. And in this room, you can use it to break this platform and get the third crystal shard. The signposting for this is meant to be the 2 fire guys in the background, because you balance out 2 fires with 2 ices to break the lava rock there. But I don't think that's exactly the best way to signpost that. It's a little bit vague compared to a lot of the other things in the game. It just feels weird. Boss here on Neo Star is Magman, big lava dude. During here in Phase 1, Magman largely stays in the back while enemies hop between the platforms. His attacks are entirely based around sending his little lava tentacles out at you, which is what you need to damage in order to actually damage the fight. Largely, I think there's 3 different ways it can use them as attacks. It can send them at you to send the platforms up to the ceiling. He can just thrust 3 of them at you at once and then just try to hit you out with them outright. I think he can just try to stab you with them outwards from a distance. And then he can do this attack where they just kind of worm around certain platforms. You need to actively be on the lookout on this fight pretty well because you actively have to keep an eye on where the pillars are going and what their animation's going to be to figure out what attack it's going to be. But largely, it's still not too hard. The biggest thing about Phase 2 is that similarly to Acro back on Aquastar, this is a 2-phase fight, so you're in for something a little longer. Thankfully, while it might look like it, Phase 2 is not you being chased by the Magman, he's just walking us over to the new arena. I'm a little vague about his hitbox in this phase. I think you need to generally aim for his face, but you can be a little bit around that. In this phase, he can breathe a giant amount of fire where you need to kind of get close to him to avoid that. He can disappear underground and summon some fire birds to try and attack you outright, as well as move across the screen doing that. If you're going without copy abilities, the birds are your main method of attack here, I believe. And he can also just outwardly smash his head against the ceiling and cause rocks to fall down. That's probably overall your best bet if you want to try and do damage to him, because you can get a couple of rocks at once and do some good damage at him like that. I think Phase 2 is the more interesting phase, but it's also because I'm a lot more involved, but Phase 1 is definitely more visually stimulating. Now, worth noting, I haven't really talked about this part of this game's mechanics yet, but in some Kirby games, you lose your copy ability by getting hit once. Kirby 64 is one of the ones where that's not quite the case. You either need to take a lot of hits in a row, or get hit by a very strong attack to have it be immediately knocked out of you. And boss fights can largely do that a lot more easily than just standard enemies, but that just makes sense, you know? Neo Star is all done. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in Part 5, we're going from Neo Star over to Shiver Star, which has continents that largely resemble Earth. Oh no. See you guys then.